No matter who you are or where you go, heading outside even for a few minutes is always worth it. I'm your host, Amy Bouchatz, and here at Humans Outside, we're using the Humans Outside 365 Challenge to build a life around spending time in nature while hearing from fascinating outdoor-minded guests. As a journalist for 19 years, I've let curiosity be my guide. After my husband's injuries from military service, we started looking for a better way to live. That's why we moved sight unseen to Alaska to see if an outdoor-focused life was the answer. Since September 2017, I've personally spent at least 20 consecutive minutes outside every single day, no matter what, to explore how nature can change my life. Ready to hear from experts and outdoor lovers who make heading into nature just a part of who they are while we work to do the same? Let's go! Back in 2017, when I first started my daily outdoor habit, that 20 minutes a day, every day, no matter what, I knew I needed to present it to myself as a challenge, not just as a new habit. And I knew I needed rules or commandments, if you will, to make my challenge a success. Those were things like deciding I'd go out for at least 20 minutes and laying out that for me, sleeping in a tent counts as going outside, but driving with the window and the car down does not. And why did I know I needed a challenge with rules? Because I had read Gretchen Rubin's books, The Happiness Project, Happier at Home, and The Four Tendencies. I knew that as what she calls an upholder, someone who responds equally to inner and outer expectations, I would be successful by setting my mind to a quote-unquote challenge. And because having commandments for her own one-year happiness project gave her guide rails for making the most of it, I knew I needed those too. I was so excited about the project that at about a year or so in, Gretchen and I even exchanged an email or two about my outdoor habit and what I've been working on here to share it with you. What I'm trying to tell you is Gretchen Rubin's work has inspired me. So imagine my excitement when, 3 years after I started asking you to join me on taking that 20-minute daily challenge via this podcast, she started her own 20-ish daily outdoor challenge for her fans and listeners of her podcast, Happier with Gretchen Rubin. This month, she's also launching her new book, Life in 5 Senses, which explores how leaning into our 5 senses can transform our experience of life. All of that to say, I am so excited to have Gretchen here with me today to talk about leaning into life through the 5 senses and how doing so is impacting her own outdoor habit. Today, Gretchen is going to share tips, tricks, and takeaways for making the most of your senses as you head outside daily. Gretchen, welcome to Humans Outside.
I'm so happy to be talking to you. Thanks so much for having me to talk about one of my favorite subjects, going outside.
Yes. So we start our episodes imagining ourselves with our guests in one of their favorite outdoor spaces, like we're hanging out, having a conversation somewhere that you like to be outside. So where are we with you today?
I live in New York City, and so my favorite place to be outside is Central Park. And my favorite place in Central Park usually is Bethesda Fountain, which is this beautiful fountain where you can sort of stand up high and look down on it. But it is also the season of blossoming trees in Central Park. So now being underneath the beautiful magnolia trees or cherry blossom trees is also my favorite place to be.
So if we were going to, pivot this to senses, what you have is sight and sound and smell going on here, just sort of like a big package deal with the blossoms and the sound of the water and just seeing it all that color, just great. So
yeah, and then you can feel things too, like you can touch the bark of a tree or metal railings or leaves, and so, which I'm a big toucher, so I will often do that, just like reach out and just, people say, don't touch. I'm like, I touch all the time. I'm a grown up. I can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you become someone who likes to go outside and hang out by this beautiful fountain and blossoms in Central Park?
Well, so many good things happen when we go outside. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. And in my long study of happiness, it's just sort of like you can bundle up so many things when you go outside. You're getting light in your face, and that's really good for your immunity, your mood, your sleep, just all the circadian rhythm. You're probably exercising, even if you're just, walking around the neighborhood, walking your dog the way I do, or even if you're just taking a cup of coffee and sitting in your backyard, like just inevitably you end up kind of moving around more. It's connecting to nature. I think a lot of us feel like we're trapped behind our screens all the time, and being outside puts you in nature. You feel the weather. You feel the wind in your face, the changing smells. And it's, it often connects us to more transcendent feelings, like looking at a sunset or the sky or watching the birds. These just tie us to sort of the great rhythms of nature and helps put our, our ordinary kind of irritations and grievances into perspective because you're reminded of the great patterns of nature.
Was this something you always gravitated to, or is this an adult life learning?
I know I am such a couch potato. I am a kid where my parents had to like specifically kick me outside because I would just stay inside and read all day long if I could. But I always did enjoy being in the outdoors. There was a tree in front of our house when I was growing up that had this very complicated set of roots. And for some reason, I just found these fascinating. So I would just like water the tree and make these like tiny waterfalls and little landscapes. So I did sometimes go outside, but I didn't sort of consciously understand that it was an element that I had to purposely include in my life and make sure that it didn't drop out. I don't know about you, but one thing I find is like, we'll have something that makes us very happy, and then somehow something changes and it drops out of our schedule and we don't notice it maybe for 5-10 years. And you're like, oh, wow. Oh, what happened? I love being in a book group, but now that leader left, we haven't gotten together for 10 years. And so I do think it's helpful to consciously acknowledge that something's important. So like you say, you can put it on your calendar, you can make a challenge out of it, or whatever that would look like for you, so that you don't sort of accidentally forget to do something that's really valuable.
Well, it's because things take effort. And
they do.
Just not doing them is so much easier.
Yes. They take effort. They take time. They take a little bit of planning often. Sometimes you have to deal with other people's time and effort and energy, or, their schedules. Yeah. So you really have to put some effort into building it in often.
It's like one of those things, like you have kids and you maybe sing the same song to your child every night before bed, and you're just there, Mom, come sing to me. You're like, oh my gosh, again. And you go do it. And then one night they stop and you think, oh, thank God, I don't have to go sing. And then pretty soon you realize, I haven't sung to my kid in 1.5 years, and I really miss that. And now that's over and gone. And that's sad. And having that moment where you just appreciate the things, even like the good things about something that take a little effort. I was skiing yesterday, and I rode up the lift with a lady who was looking like she was having a blast. And she told me that she had not been skiing since the 1980s, and she couldn't figure out why. She lived in Anchorage. She just didn't go. And it just wasn't a part of her life patterns. It's a kind of extreme example of what you're saying. Like you wake up one day and realize, I really enjoy this thing and I just haven't gone and done it. But going skiing takes a lot of effort, so much effort. And that's what we talked about in the lift.
Right. Well, I mean, very much the same way. There's like a joke. My sister lives in Los Angeles, and there's a joke that nobody in Los Angeles goes to the beach. And a friend of mine was a surfer, and he deliberately, like when he moved to LA, he deliberately lived like within 10 minutes of the beach because he's like, otherwise I won't go, because nobody goes. And so it is one of these things where you think, well, why wouldn't I do this? I love it, but it just doesn't happen. It just falls out. And yeah, so I think it's really good to explicitly acknowledge that something's important to us, will make us happier and healthier. And so there's a priority to it.
Absolutely. Well, you love a challenge. And as I mentioned, that's something I personally relate to. I've been inspired by your other challenge. Your new book explores a challenge of leaning into your senses for a full year. So, and exploring each of those in turn. Why this challenge? What brought you to the moment of, it's the 5 senses for me now?
Well, for me, it was really like this kind of shock and epiphany that I had. So I get pink eye fairly regularly. I guess I'm susceptible to pink eye. And when it was worse, it wasn't going away. So I went to the eye doctor. And as I was leaving, he said to me very offhandedly, well, be sure to come in for your regular checkup because, as you know, you're at greater risk for losing your vision. And I was like, what are you talking about? I did not know that. Why? And he said, oh, well, you're very severely nearsighted, and that means you're at greater risk for having a detached retina. And if that starts to happen, we want to catch it right away or it can affect your vision. And the thing is, I have a friend who had just lost some of his vision to a detached retina. So this felt very real to me. And so I walk out the door. As I said, I live in New York City. So I was walking home from the eye doctor, and I looked around and I was like, I did not notice one thing on my way here. Like very often it's only when we're faced with losing something that we really appreciate it. And it just made me realize, oh my gosh, my sight, I'm taking all of this for granted. I think it's so important to me, but I'm not really looking at anything. And then it was like, as if every knob in my brain just got jammed to the maximum setting. And I could see everything with crystal clarity. I could hear every sound like on a separate track. I could smell every smell. I live in New York City, a lot of smells. I could smell every smell. It was like this psychedelic experience walking home. And it just showed me that, I'd been studying happiness for years, but I felt like there was something that was missing. There was some piece of the puzzle that I wasn't grasping. And that walk showed me it's connecting to the world through my five senses. And that's the element that I need to bring in. So it was really the shock of considering loss. And of course, I know I could have a meaningful, full, rich life if I did lose some of my senses. It's more that I didn't want to take them for granted. I wanted to appreciate them while I had them so that I wouldn't regret later thinking, why didn't I take advantage of these senses?
Yeah, really intentionally leaning into what you've got while you've got it.
Yeah, and I have to make everything into a project. I have to do everything on purpose, or else I just, stay up in a fog of preoccupation in my own head. So I needed to figure out a program to deal with the five senses if I wanted to really tackle it.
I completely understand that. And as a part of your experiment, you decided to visit one place every day for a year. Are you still visiting this place regularly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I visit the Metropolitan Museum every day.
Still.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'll probably do that forever. I love it. I'm so fortunate because I have the time and the freedom to go, and I live within walking distance. So I'm incredibly fortunate. Also, as a New York State resident, I can go for free, though I did join as a member because I'm like, hey, look, I'm going every day. I should support the institution. But, here's the thing. I had lived within walking distance of the Met for years, and I almost never went. And so, and for me, and maybe you're the same, it sounds like we're the same in a lot of ways. For me, it's easier to do something every day than to do it some days. It's more fun. Also, it's more interesting, and it's also just kind of easier because then it's just part of every day, except Wednesday because the Met is closed on Wednesday. But yeah, and I was just very intrigued to see how the experience would change through repetition and familiarity. I've always been very interested in repetition, just in a lot of ways, and I wanted to see how the Met would change as I went over and over again.
That struck me as so interesting in your book, which I just read, because that is a very common thing for people who go outside. If you are forest bathing or this practice of visiting the same spot as a sit spot every day. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's a sit spot, but it's a museum, sort of. Very related, though.
Wait, so I don't know that term, sit spot. So explain that.
Yeah, so in forest bathing, you would have a sit spot. So it's literally somewhere, a spot that you sit, and you sit there and you notice. And the more you visit, the more you notice, just as you have experienced.
Yes.
And if you go there every day, you might start noticing different things. And you are just being in the same nature spot over and over and over again. And so people who do this practice may do it for a period of a month, maybe longer. They may stay there 5 minutes. There are no rules. There are some best practices. And I am not a certified forest therapist, but this is a concept that's been introduced to me by some people who are. And it's fascinating to me because if you can imagine, you go, let's say your sit spot is against a lovely tree where you and I would very much like to read a book. And you go there and you're just noticing. And as the season changes, so does the things around the tree. Or even in a week, things change around a tree. And you can just take it in and have this sort of meditative noticing practice that is just so beneficial. Now, I will say, I hesitate to do this because I like variety and because I prefer to go on a walk on the same path every day, sort of like what you do at the Met. Also, I'm afraid that if I do this, that I talk myself out of it, right? Oh, I know I will go to the sit spot, then it'll be cold, then it'll be January, then I won't want to do it anymore, so on and so forth. It's, the future keeps me from the now. But it's very similar to what you're talking about with the Met, that you go and just notice in a same repetition.
Well, absolutely. And I think that the point you're making is really important, which is no tool fits every hand. And I think people sometimes are like, well, this is the way you should do it. Somebody said to me, well, if you're going to go to the Met every day, what you have to do is go and look at a painting or an object for like a half an hour. That's the way you have to do it. And I'm like, I don't have to do anything. You know what I mean? That's your way of visiting the Met. It's not the only way of visiting the Met. Maybe I would like to do that one day, but so far I have not wanted to do it that way. And I think you're right. It's like a sit spot, I'm sure for some people is an immensely attractive idea. And for others, you're like, well, I'd rather be in motion. I don't want to sit. Or I know that over time I would drift away from that in a way, you know. And I think that sometimes people don't think about themselves. They sort of think, well, other people can tell me the right way or the best way. Or if it works for you, it will work for me. Or if it doesn't work for me, there's something wrong with me. Instead of saying, like, I am a person who doesn't meditate, you know, and everybody assumes that I do, because if you write about happiness, people think that you're really into meditation. I'm like, meditation doesn't work for me. And many people are like, oh, but Gretchen, going to the Met is meditation for you. And I'm like, I assure you, it is not. It is not meditation for me. It's recess for me. Yeah. I'm wandering around. I'm looking at things. I'm doing whatever I want. I'm not trying to discipline my mind, because that's what I need. And maybe you're the same, because it sounds like we're the same. I need to let my mind off the leash. Mm-hmm. I don't need more discipline, and I don't want that. And so a sit spot sounds terrific, and it would get at some of the same things, like this idea of repetition and seeing things unfold over time. There's like a fascination to that. Mm-hmm. But there are many ways you could bring that, or you could make it flexible so that, I mean, maybe you're a person who loves sort of creative expression, and so you're like, I'm going to go on a certain walk and take a picture of the sun rising over a river, and then I'll have this kind of picture image that I'll do something with. And so for you, it's about that. I wouldn't want to do that, but for other people, that might make it very compelling. So there's all kinds of ways that we can take these aims and adapt them to suit our own particular interests and idiosyncrasies. Absolutely. Instead of thinking that there's a right way.
I'm 2,035 days into going outside every day. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I can confirm for you that every day is a lot of days. And yes. There are more than enough opportunities to follow that curiosity that you're talking about and try new things. And you could even try doing the same thing for many days in a row, and there would still be a lot of days.
Yes.
And that's not to take for granted, like what you're going back to on the census. That's not to take for granted what you have right now. Yes. But it also is freeing. So there is still many days. You could go to the Met on any day and decide, this is the day that I feel like looking at a painting for 30 minutes.
Yes. And so I think you just hit on something so important, and I don't think everybody understands this, which is, if you do something every day, no one day matters. And so you can do it short, you can do it long. It can be bad, it can be good. You can be bored, it can be disappointed. Like, it doesn't matter, because there's just more. And with something like nature or the Met, it's like, it's infinite, it's vast, it's limitless. And so it's very freeing to think, well, I don't have to come to this national park and drink it all in one afternoon and like race from place to place. It's like, you got all the time in the world. You got all the time you need. It can be big, it can be small. And there's something very freeing about that. And then you get to places you don't expect to go, because it's happening so often that there's room for unexpected things to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's something special about doing something a lot.
Yeah, totally agree. What is your favorite sense? And did that change over the year that you were exploring this?
Ooh, what a good question. My favorite sense, I think if I went into it, I would say that my favorite sense was smell. I'm very wired for sight, but all of us are wired for sight. That's how we're hardwired. That's just, sight has the most real estate in the brain. We just draw on sight all the time. But I do love smell. I've always loved my sense of smell. And so I think I get much more pleasure out of it, because, the more we know, the more we notice. And by sort of learning about my sense of smell, I appreciate it much more. One of the things that's interesting is, part one is it's hard to know your least favorite. So I have this quiz now, which you can take, GretchenRubin.com/quiz, which will tell you your neglected sense, which is the one at the bottom. And that's good to know, because that's where you have all this low-hanging fruit. Like, I loved learning more about my sense of smell, but really my neglected sense is taste. And so it's really like I almost gained more because I had more room to go with taste. So it's really useful to know about your neglected sense, because that points out to you, well, maybe there are all these opportunities for learning or enjoyment or comfort or pleasure that you've been overlooking. But your most appreciated sense really still is like, there's something special about that sense too.
Yeah. What are we missing when we take those things for granted? When we don't stop to notice them, when we just say, this is my neglected sense and I'm okay with that?
Well, I think we just lose the opportunity to make the world so much more rich and vivid and to get so much more pleasure and connection from it. So say taste. I'm just not that interested in the sense of taste. But I thought, well, how can I use it? And I've never been, and maybe it's part of this is like, I love seeing friends and everything, but I never really feel like having a dinner party or whatever, because maybe because I'm just not that interested in taste. But I thought, well, how could I come up with a way to tap into taste in a way that would be social and connect me with other people, but maybe not the dinner party, which is not that attractive to me. So I had a taste party, and I also went to Flavor University for a couple of days, and we did all these taste comparisons, and that was by far my favorite thing. I love taste comparisons. So these friends over, and I had mystery samples of 4 varieties of apples and varieties of chocolate and a mystery beverage, and everybody had to rate it and discuss it. And it was the most fun ever. And it was just this different way to tap into a sensory experience and really revel in our sense of taste together. We talked about our memories. We were just laughing and joking around. All these disagreements, about what matters. Turns out some people are super focused on mouthfeel and texture. Other people don't really care. I love things that are sweet. I'm not that very interested in taste, but I do have a really strong sweet tooth. Other people have a much lower bar for sweet. And it was just super fun, and it would never have occurred to me to do something like that if I hadn't said to myself, hey, how can I tap into the fun of my sense of taste and its ability to draw me closer to other people beyond the conventional, let's go out to dinner together, why don't you come over for dinner, and really lean into it. And it was just so much fun.
Hey humans, just a quick break to remind you that if you want to build your own outdoor habit, the Humans Outside 365 Challenge is a great way to get started. Cool and exclusive challenge swag, including a finisher medal and a decal, is waiting for you. All you need to do is visit humansoutside.com/challenge. Don't get left out. Go to humansoutside.com/challenge to learn more now. Okay, back to the show. So, of course, we want to talk to you about your senses and how they're working with your current yearly challenge, which is to go outside 23 minutes a day in 2023, or 23 in 23. Now, you did walk 20 and 20. Last year, you did rest 22 and 22. There's a theme here, obviously. So
21 and 21.
21 and 21. Yes, exactly. So how do you typically spend your outdoor time, and what is your favorite thing to do?
Well, my favorite thing to do is to walk in Central Park. One of the things that I realized is that, if you, because I live in New York City, I thought of myself, and I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, so I'm not a lifelong New Yorker. I thought of myself as being very urban and not a very outdoorsy person. But then when I started talking to other people, once we started this Go Outside 23 and 23 challenge, what I realized is that actually in New York, we spend a lot of time outside because of public transportation, and just, it's instead of jumping in my car and driving to the drugstore and going out into the drugstore and then driving home, I walk 6 blocks to the drugstore and I walk home. So, that's time outside. So just for me, I realized I was spending a lot more time outside than I had realized, which was actually great. I think sometimes we get so focused on the to-dos that we don't give ourselves the to-das. And so I was like, wow, I'm doing a lot better on this already than I realized. So that was sort of a good thing to realize, just because there is so much benefit from being outside. But I do prefer to have 23 minutes solid outside. So I'm really having, it's not just part of running errands, but really it's its own activity. So sometimes I'll walk, sort of for 15 minutes, sort of up and down a long avenue. I love to look into shop windows, or I will go into Central Park and walk around. Just about every day I go for a walk in Central Park. But interestingly, I almost always do the exact same walk. So I definitely am somebody who's drawn to doing the same thing every time, even though I have all the beauties of Central Park at my disposal. And yet I always feel like taking the very same walk. And so that's how I like to do it.
What you're striking on is the difference between a chore and recess, as you said earlier. That walking to and from the drugstore on this task is sort of a chore. And you're outside, but you're not there to be outside. You're there by virtue of the fact that you had a chore. And when you are walking in Central Park, it's what you referred to as recess earlier, where you're giving yourself that chance to be intentional about being outside and to notice and, talking about 5 senses, use all of them for that experience. And in my experience and talking to many people who go outside, the difference is one is restorative and the other one is a task. And there are lots of examples of that in the world. Eating can be a task or it can be very restorative. We have to eat to live, or you could eat to enjoy. And the difference is in how you approach it and maybe in what you are receiving. A fancy meal is still nourishing, but it feels different than eating broccoli because it's good for you.
Right. Right. And it's funny because the Go Outside 23 challenge is a challenge that I did on the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast with my sister, who's my co-host. And so we were talking about it in advance about kind of how we were framing this for ourselves and for other people. And one question was, did walk into the drugstore count? Like you talked about, like, does being in a tent count? Does being in your car with the window open count? Like, you sort of have these questions of what counts. And we decided, like, everybody can make their own rules, but if they were going to ask us what we considered counting, we would consider walking to the drugstore counting as going outside. Because we're like, if it counts for you, it counts for you, because there are a lot of benefits to being outside, even if it's not this intentional thing. You've got the sun, you've got the emotion.
Right.
If you start, you're more likely to keep going. I think people who are regularly walking around are more likely to walk for fun than people who are just like really used to being like sitting and relying on their cars. But I agree, there's just a vast difference between doing something for pleasure and like really leaning into all of its delight than just like running from one place to the other. But there's sort of no one right way to do it.
No, there's not. I get that question a lot, by the way, what counts? And the answer is exactly what you said, right? Well, whatever you feel like counts. And I wanted guardrails, as I mentioned earlier, to understand what would count for me. And so
yes, exactly.
I love riding in a car with the window down, but it's not going to replace the other benefits I get from other things. Also, as we said earlier, every day is a lot of days. It's all the days. And so you can have your outdoor time be a more chore feeling sometimes.
Absolutely.
And have it be restorative other days. And that's okay. There are no laws.
No, you're out running around and you're like, oh my gosh, I was on my feet for 4 hours. I was outside for half of that. Like, of course that counts. Yeah, no, I think, but it's interesting. I don't know if you found this, but people really want very strict rules, but then they break the rules and they give up. And I'm like, you can build in flexibility and you don't have to do it the way somebody else does it. And yet I do think that there is this just sort of sense that there is a right way to do things. And I often feel that people are disappointed when I sort of say, well, like when I go to the Met, it's like people really expect there to be this very strict set of guidelines that I follow for it to count as a visit. And I'm like, I could walk in the door and turn out and walk out. I can walk up to the front door and never walk through the door. I could just go up the big stairs and come back down. That to me counts. And people are like,
right. Because it's the practice of going. It's breaking the inertia of being in your office.
100%. It's the practice of going. Very well said. Yes, I never thought of putting it that way. That's exactly what it is.
For my outdoor time, the reason I struck on 20 minutes was because I wanted to pick an amount of time that I felt would be beneficial. And there were studies at the time, this was several years ago, that said 20 minutes was a pretty good amount of time. There have been more studies since, and so confirmed, yay. But the other thing is that I had tried a little bit like a pre-challenge where between Memorial Day and Labor Day, I had said, I'm just going to go outside every day and see how it goes. Can I do it? Because I had moved to Alaska and I wanted to be someone who went outside. And then I found that I was not, that I was letting weather get in the way.
Right.
And so I thought, okay, let me see how this is. So for all of those days I did. I went outside. I had some great adventures. We saw some new things. But there was at least one day when the weather wasn't very good. And I went outside. I just can so vividly remember this, probably because my senses were so involved. I'm getting wet, right? It's cold. It smells like rain. I remember staying there watching raindrops drop into a cup of coffee, okay, scowling on my porch. It's supposed to be the summer. What is happening here? And I stood out there for, maybe 5 minutes tops. And I turned around and I went back inside. And I realized that if that's how I acted on a summer day in a rainstorm, when things got real in January with -20 or whatever, I simply was going to not go outside very much at all. And so I knew that I needed some rules for me to keep my commitment to myself. And other than that, like whatever feels good counts. So in January, I bundle up. Also, if you're going to bundle up, you should at least, in my personal opinion, spend as much time outside as it took you to get dressed. So
no, I was just saying that that's part of the thing. Is just like the proportion of time getting ready to time, inactivity. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good rule. At least as much time as it took you to gear up.
That's
yeah,
right.
for sure.
That's right.
Yeah.
Even Stephen. So you mentioned coming up with this challenge with your sister. What was the inspiration for doing this challenge this year, 23 and 23?
Well, I think I think people do like a challenge. And it's funny, like sometimes there's things that you want to do, but when there's sort of the feeling like this is a thing and we're all doing it and like we're giving each other ideas and support and enthusiasm, and it's like something I can kind of get credit for. I've got a name for it. I keep getting reminded to do it. And one of the things we knew about our listeners of the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast was that people really wanted to make more time to read. And as somebody who studies happiness, and somebody who loves to read, this was very noticeable to me, because I was like, if people love reading and they want to read, why are they not reading? Like, that to me was a very important question. And so I thought, well, if we do this, maybe this will help people find time to read. And it was just to walk. Well, read was 21, and to walk. And as you say, there's just this enormous research about walking for 20 minutes, as even apart from being outside. So we thought, well, let's do it. Well, walk 20 and 20. And then it was the pandemic year. So this was just more like people just attached to this far more than we could even imagine, because there was just so much restlessness and a desire to kind of, do something that you could do and be part of something. So walk 20 and 20 was just hugely successful. And the thing about there are all sorts of health benefits from walking 20. So we were hearing from people who like, their dogs were so much happier because the dogs were getting outside, or they were like, or the people were getting off medication because they were getting this exercise, or because they'd done a little bit, they could do more, or they were doing it with their spouses, and now their spouses were off medication. Like, just all these follow-on things. Then we did read. Then by 22, we were like, everybody needs a rest. People are just like so frazzled. So it was rest. And then we thought, well, what are people really hankering for? And what we heard from people is they really wanted to find ways to get outside. They wanted it, and yet somehow they weren't doing it. Just like you were saying, here I am in Alaska, and it's just not happening. So let's put a little structure around it, a little bit of a challenge around it. Talk about like reminders, like there's no bad weather, just bad clothing decisions, all that kind of thing. And it's just really fun. It's very fun to like figure out what's the yearly challenge going to be this year. People are very worried. What's going to happen in 2049? I'm like, we've got a plan for that. Don't worry. And like you say, don't worry. Don't not do something now because you're like 10 years from now, I can't do it.
Yeah. That's so crazy. Yeah. But I do that. We all do that,
We're
all like,
do that.
Oh man, I can't commit to eating healthy because in 3 years I may want to eat pizza. Well,
yes. Yeah. Well, because I wrote Better Than Before, which is my book that's all about habit formation. I'm very familiar. There's 10 categories of loopholes. And there's a loophole for that, which is why I can't do this now, is because I can't do it.
Yeah, there you go. So beautifully, going outside and your 5 senses are such a perfect match. And so I'm wondering, like, how are your 5 senses in that experiment influencing your outdoor time now?
Well, part of it is I'm just so much more aware, because what happens with a lot of the senses is that, they're running in the background, but they're very easy to ignore if we don't pay attention. So one funny thing that happened to me in Central Park was once I started paying attention to smell and just really deliberately sort of saying, what am I smelling? What am I smelling? Oh, I'm by this pond. Can I smell the pond? Oh, I'm by this big pile of dead leaves. Can I smell the dead leaves? I'm walking by the carriage horses. Can I smell horses? Well, there's this walk. As I say, I do the same walk all the time for years. And I started noticing at this one corner, there was this very particular smell. And then so first I sort of noticed it. And then I noticed, wow, I'm really noticing it every single time. And then I was like, well, what does it smell like? And then I tried to put words to it, which can be tricky with smell. And I was like, well, what it smells like is kind of like apple cider. It's kind of like this warm, spicy, very nice smell. Then I looked around. Was there a plant? Was there like a food truck? What was going on? Why did it always smell this way? It looked just like every other place in the park. And then I finally thought, well, why don't I look it up on Google? It seemed so idiosyncratic,
Yeah.
But I thought, well, maybe other people have experienced this. Well, it turns out that the Central Park uses clove oil. as a kind of pesticide. And so there must be this must be a place where they put a lot of this clove oil. So what I was smelling was clove. But I had been walking through that for years before I even noticed that I was smelling that.
Yeah. What you're talking about strikes me as mindfulness. You said earlier you don't do meditation, but meditation and mindfulness, they might be neighbors, but they are not the same thing.
100%. I could not agree with you more. They're often used interchangeably, and yeah, I think mindfulness is a much broader term than meditation.
And mindfulness is using your senses and noticing. That's literally what it is. That's all it is.
Yes. Well, and I think because I really value mindfulness, but I need a concrete way to do it. And I think that going through the five senses makes that mindfulness more concrete, because it's easier to say, like, what am I smelling? Than, ooh, let me appreciate this moment. It kind of gives you gives you more framework. And of course, many people use the senses in meditation. There's a very famous 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 meditation, or people will like meditate while they like watch a flame. And so these things do overlap, and many people use their five senses in meditation. But I think, yeah, mindfulness is just sort of a much broader term about like intentionality and noticing. But I wanted to do it in like a playful, unstructured, kind of fun way. And I think the five senses really make it very like playful and fun and energizing, at least for me.
So we've just talked about mindfulness, but are there any other personal practices you find especially useful for leaning into your senses or taking a special advantage of them during your outdoor time?
Oh, yeah. Well, one thing that's great is like a five senses journal. So I'm actually creating one of this, like that I'll sell in my shop, but I just created one like with a notebook, just wrote like seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And I would write down like a notable experience. Now, often those were things that were outside. They weren't necessarily, but of course you could do it just for outside if you wanted to do it, to tie it to your going outside. But like it might be like, oh, I was walking around downtown and I heard church bells. Or I was walking through the park and I smelled the daffodils. Or I was, standing on a street corner and I put my hand against the lamppost to feel like the bubbles under the paint, and then just writing that down. And so partly it does help to kind of raise our awareness, because when you're looking for these notable experiences, it helps you to notice them, because the brain is like flagging them as, ooh, this is useful information. You need to fill out that page. And what I also found is another thing that I, as a happiness researcher, I kind of don't do what I'm supposed to do, which is keep a gratitude journal. So much research about gratitude, which I 100% believe and accept, but for me, the gratitude journal was not a useful tool. I found it very kind of annoying to keep a gratitude journal. But what I found is that this five senses journal really is a kind of gratitude journal, because I feel like it's my way of sort of paying tribute to the beauty of the world and all of the people and places and experiences around me. That if you're like, oh my gosh, the fur on that cat was like the most unbelievably beautiful pattern of colors. That feels like a gratitude practice. But again, it feels concrete to me in a way that I find it much more satisfying. But it's definitely a way to help as you're going outside, to tap into all of the senses that you're experiencing, and in a very, as you say, in a very mindful and attentive way. So that, because you don't want to be outside and then just be thinking about your to-do list the whole time, which is absolutely something that happens to me if I'm not careful.
Right. Or looking at my phone, I'll get pinged by something, I get distracted, I pick it up, and the next thing I know, there has actually been a time that I almost quite literally walked into a moose.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah. Because I was...
Alaska problems.
Alaska problems, exactly. But I was 100% answering a text message and walking down the path, and I looked up and I was like, oh my gosh,
And the moose is like, what the heck?
Exactly.
How far do I have to go to get away from people and their phones?
Exactly. So in New York City, you walk in front of oncoming traffic,
Oh yeah, or a lamppost. This is a very common thing. Like if there's something about a lamppost that it can get like right... Somehow, how some things can get right in your peripheral vision. So if you're bent down to look at your phone, the lamp, like something straight in front of you is in that blind spot. I mean, I've seen people just can give themselves a concussion from walking into a lamppost, and I've done it.
Well, maybe a moose is our version of a lamppost. They're huge, but you would be shocked at how easy they hide behind things, because from the side, it's like very broad, right?
But aren't they loud? Don't they make a lot of...
Not really. they're just kind of standing there munching.
Oh, right.
And so on the side it's very broad, but when you're coming up to them,
Sure.
they're very narrow.
Well,
It's
they're the color of nature.
And they're the color of nature.
Designed to blend in.
Exactly.
Right.
And so you kind of get this, you might get this feeling like this feels very moosey around here today, and you can't really explain why. And then you'll look around and be like, there's like a moose standing behind a tree that you think is way too skinny for this, but there they are, and you only notice them because they happen to move. And yeah, it's an
It's
Alaska
like a
problem.
Gary Larson cartoon.
Yes,
I
it is.
picture this moose like hanging out, like
correct.
smoking a cigarette where you can't see them.
Yes, precisely. All right, well, Gretchen, thank you so much for joining us. If you would walk us out, though, describing maybe a favorite outdoor moment that you've had as just a final thing.
Well, speaking of Alaska, I have amazing. I went on a long camping trip in Alaska, but I was up in the tundra, so I didn't see many moose walking around there. But it was amazing, and the light, and the clarity of the air. And I remember though thinking like, well, speaking of is a tent inside or outside, I'm a person who's very susceptible to cold. And I remember on the second night it occurring to me, wow, I'm not going to be inside for a month. And I'm in Alaska. And I was like, but that's okay. I'm here for it. So anyway, beautiful Alaska. It's definitely one of the all-time highlights of my life in terms of being outside.
Well, Gretchen, thank you so much for joining us today on Humans Outside. I sure appreciate your time.
It was so great to talk to you.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Humans Outside. Help me out by leaving a 5-star rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help other listeners find the podcast too. Now, go get outside. Until next time, we'll see you out there.